Well, an interesting set of readings this morning. I'll start with the letter of James. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For all of us make many mistakes. Not exactly the most inspiring for someone about to get up and preach, but take it where it may be from. I always like saying at Messiah that if, when they arrived at the pearly gates in heaven, and they were told that some of their understandings of the faith were not quite kosher, they could say, well, that's what Richard said, and have it go on. I won't be seeing you there. So what we do with the readings this morning, I think, is grapple with complexity and paradox. We don't believe in a teaching and an understanding of Jesus that is one-dimensional but multidimensional. And one of the hardest things about Christianity is the way that Jesus, as well as the biblical tradition, teaches in paradox, one thing being something else at the same time. And we're asked to hold these different aspects or elements in tension and to grapple and to wrestle with them, not to reduce them to simplicity, as the first reading reminded us, but be willing to grapple with things that are not fully understood or subtle or contradictory. So you have in today's gospel from Mark some very paradoxical things. First of all, you have poor Peter. Peter tries so hard. He's the first out of the box, and sometimes he gets it right, but not very often. So it's a moment where Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" And the answers are varied. Note that one of the first answers about the perception of Jesus is that he is the reincarnation of John the Baptist, pointing towards an early conflict between the followers of John the Baptist and the followers of Jesus. The followers of John the Baptist thinking that he might have been the Messiah, and the followers of Jesus do everything, including Mark, to make sure that there's a distancing from that understanding of who John the Baptist was. Also in the text, it's worth noting you have what's called, when you get to seminary and learn about such things, the messianic secret. Again and again, in the Gospels, we're told that Jesus teaches and then says, don't tell anyone about this. And it's very perplexing, and it's perplexed scholars who've studied Scripture as to what this means. Why be someone who is teaching and then not having that teaching be known or wanting it to be spread abroad? And one of the explanations is that the writers of the gospel, certainly Mark, the earliest gospel, is baffled why more people don't understand Jesus as being the Son of God and the Messiah. And so one explanation is that they did not spread the word, if you will, at Jesus' own instructions, so that the reluctance to follow Jesus or acknowledge him as Messiah was part of Jesus' teaching. All that aside, it's an interesting gospel, I think, because it actually resonates for us as modern hearers of the word. Because it poses the important question, what is our identity? What is Jesus' identity? And vis-a-vis by that, what is our identity as followers of Jesus? Who are we, and what do we seek in following Jesus? Now that's modern because we are consumed with the idea of branding. We all like to know, and it's a great marketing tool in the modern area of social media and communications, to have a brand. I knew that we were in trouble at Church of the Messiah when Rhinebeck became a brand. People said Rhinebeck, and people would go, oh, Rhinebeck. Now, I don't want to make the case that Jesus was an early influencer, but he is asking that very modern question of how can we be identified in the public perception, and how are we known in a more profound way by people who know us well? And are they different? Well, invariably, knowing someone well means that you don't live on the surface of identity, but go deeper into complexity and, if you will, paradox. So people may have a reputation for being one way, but you, knowing them well, know that there are contradictions and moments when people don't live up to their perceived identity. And that's very much what's rooted in the gospel story today. Now, I have an abiding interest in architecture, church architecture in particular. And I was reminded of identity this past week when I went down to our cathedral in New York City, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine at 110th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. I went down for a trustees meeting and then went down for the opening following that of a new exhibit and new installation, art installation at the cathedral, which is part of their tradition, which is a sound installation in which Thomas Tallis's beautiful anthem that he wrote is sung by recorded by 40 different voices and replayed by 40 different electronic speakers in the north transept of the cathedral. It was at the cloisters, it belongs to the Museum of Modern Art, and now it's going to be part of the cathedral's exhibits for the fall. And it was extraordinary. And if you are up in the upper part of Manhattan and on the west side, please stop in. It's about 10 minutes and it's glorious. But as I listened to the music, I was looking up at the architecture of the building, which is so compelling. As you all know, St. John's is not finished, but one day it may be, probably in a different way than it was imagined for sure. But have any of you ever wondered why our cathedral is located in Harlem? Why it's uptown? Well, it does have a history, and of course I'm always reluctant to preach on history with our historian Elliot Lindsley in the congregation. But Elliot will correct any mistakes I make, and remember James's letter, we all make mistakes sometimes. But my understanding is that the land was purchased at the end of the 19th century for the cathedral based not on it being in an area that needed to be served by the Episcopal Church in terms of sharing of resources and holding a community up, but instead was part of Episcopal pride. Now, at the time, in Midtown Manhattan, without tall buildings to the north, you could clearly see Morningside Heights, where the cathedral is located, from Midtown Manhattan. And it's said that the people that decided that would be the location was informed by the fact that it would share the plateau of Morningside Heights with two other great Episcopal associated institutions, Columbia University and St. Luke's Hospital. So, the story goes, people in Midtown in New York City would look up and see what was called the Episcopal Acropolis. They would know who ran the city and who had power. That was frustrated by the fact that buildings now you can't even see uptown at all, let alone all the way to Morningside Heights. As well, Harlem at the time was an upper middle class housing development that was meant to continue the tide of Manhattan development from south to north. So the Episcopalians thought they were getting a jump on time and the future by locating the cathedral further north where the center of the city would eventually be located, as it had moved throughout its history from Battery Park up through the island. What they didn't count on were several devastating financial panics at the end of the 19th century that meant that the development was bankrupted. And so Harlem, surrounding where the cathedral was located, became a center for African American culture and society, but also a place of tremendous poverty and tremendous need within the city. Terrible housing, terrible problems go along with poverty. And so the cathedral found itself in the midst of a community that was devastated, certainly as the 20th century went on. And the cathedral responded to that, most notably probably under Horace Donegan, Bishop Donegan's leadership, who actually halted the building of the cathedral given the profound needs of the community around it, that it was not the right thing to do, to put money into a building when there was so much human need on the doorsteps of that cathedral. And there have been proud moments of the cathedral in terms of its witness to justice and to serving the community that surrounds it, as well as the wider city, indeed. And I looked at all that and I remembered all that as I stood in the building and looked at this magnificent cathedral. But I was reminded that there's often a paradox. Our intention may be to affirm power and glory and all that goes with being an Episcopalian at the end of the 19th century. But it ends up being something that reminds us of the gospel in the way that the cathedral builders and planners could never have envisioned. A presence of God's presence in a community that needs us. Serving the needs of the community rather than itself as the priority. And that's witnessed in the unfinished character of the cathedral and its location. So let me bring it back to St. Peter's. Here we are in the midst of this beautiful, beautiful place, this beautiful community and area. Tim and I continue to be astonished. I certainly, every time I take drives now throughout the Millbrook area, and I see yet another beautiful view that I hadn't seen before. There is no doubt that we live in an extraordinarily beautiful place. And we also have an extraordinarily beautiful church building that reflects our identity. We may not be fully aware of it, but it speaks to the complexity of who we are as a people. So I love looking at a building and seeing what it has to say theologically about what we believe. And I want to draw your attention to something that I noticed when I first came. I have to say one of the joys of being here at St. Peter's is that we're not in the middle of a restoration or capital campaign. So I can be in the building without worrying about how things are going. And I love being in this building as much as I love when it's full. I also love being here when it's quiet and empty. And I've often sat and looked up at the stained glass window that's above the altar. And of course, it's the cross, that great symbol of who we are as followers of Jesus. The embodiment of the paradox, if you will, that Jesus teaches about in today's gospel. Those who want to save their life must lose it at the same time. That if you believe, as Peter did, that being the Messiah or a follower of the Messiah as your identity means you'll be given power and glory and safety, Jesus is quick to remind us that's not the kind of messiahship he was bringing into the world. Instead, it's a reminder that outside of people who are surrounded by beauty is a broken world that can often be a terrible place. A place of suffering, of risk, of damage, all the things that characterize the world around us. And we are meant to live in that tension between the beauty of where we live and the reality of the world beyond our doors and our community. And it's clear that Jesus wants us to serve that world and bring the good news that he brought through us and what we do. So back to St. Peter's. Don't know if you've ever noticed it, but the cross that's in this glass does not suggest wood. If you look carefully at it, it's composed by a series of small, colored, beautiful colored glass, jewel-like pieces of glass that actually are meant to be glorious and beautiful. And I love the fact that the thing that's in front of us every Sunday is itself a paradox. The terrible instrument of suffering that Jesus endured, the worst punishment that the Romans could come up with, as well as a promise of beauty and glory, in that we understand the suffering that's involved in the world and in our own lives. We're meant to live in a place that isn't one or the other. And even more importantly for the mission of St. Peter's, the recognition that we are meant to help others who don't have the resources, the security, the comfort, or even the beauty that we have in this place. So for me, that cross is actually there to inform us about our work and our faith as the people of God. It's ever before us, reminding us that although we experience beauty, the promise of glory in the resurrection of Jesus, it also involves suffering and loss. And we are meant to do something about that. We're meant to do something about it in our own community, for people in need, people who are suffering, people who have suffered loss. We're meant to be there for them. But we're also meant to be there for the world, and we must never lose sight of that. And for me, the powerful thing about Christianity, as I understand it, and I think as we understand it as a people, is that our identity is certainly to be a follower of Jesus, to affirm the things that he taught, that he said, and that he did. And that as important as our relationship is as a community here, ultimately we are also about being in relationship with the world. And that we are meant to be in the world when we leave here, a world that is not safe, that is broken for so many people. And Jesus wants to do something about that. And may we be given the grace and the faith to do just that. Amen.